So greetings and thank you all for coming to this event at today's presentation here with Polly Nicholson. I'm Jamie Boyer. I'm the Vice President for Education here at the Garden. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located on the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. Before I make my remarks, I'd just like to mention that the garden offers many classes, workshops, public lectures in landscape design, floral design, gardening, and many more. And to highlight a few of those, here comes my pitch. Our next round of plant studio classes start next month. Dig into gardening, botany, floral design, landscape design, more from the comfort of your own space, wherever it fits your schedule or wherever you are in the world. Our School of Professional Horticulture, if you're looking to go back to school, is accepting applications for the next incoming class. Those applications are deadline August 1st. Get them in. Registration is still open for our summer intensive programs in floral design, gardening, landscape design, and therapeutic horticulture. And last but not least, if you are a parent, know a parent, or want to help out a parent, we have beautiful summer classes for kids in both science and gardening. Those classes start in July. Okay, our special guest today is Polly Nicholson. She's an organic gardener, holder of the National Collection of Tulip Historic, and the owner of Bain Flowers in Wiltshire, UK. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Daily Telegraph, House and Garden, Gardens Illustrated, Country Life, and BBC Gardener's World. Inspired by a visit to Hortus Boborum, a tulip museum outside of Amsterdam, Polly has cultivated a horticulture empire on her countryside estate, preserving endangered varieties of tulips that once bloomed centuries ago so that future generations can enjoy them. Today, Polly will be discussing her newly released debut book, The Tulip Garden, a beautifully illustrated tribute to one of the world's most beloved blooms. An essential reference for tulip lovers, florists, and gardeners. The Tulip Garden combines the flower's rich cultural history with practical advice for growing all types of tulips today. After her presentation, Polly will be joined by author and garden designer Lindsey Taylor. Lindsey was a garden editor for Martha Stewart Living, Domino, and Garden Design magazines, and currently writes Flower School for the Wall Street Journal. Lindsey studied horticulture and landscape design at Cornell University, as well as NYBG. So welcome back. Her book, Art in Flower, was released this year by Fata. Please join me in welcoming both Polly and Lindsey.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. This is my first visit to a botanical garden in America, and I believe it's the best one. Thank you to NYBG, and thank you mostly to Lindsey for talking with me after my short presentation. I'm really excited to meet her and a great fan of her and her new book. So you might think that on this beautiful summer's day, tulips aren't seasonal, but actually they're flowering in my garden in the UK at the moment. And that's because I'm so greedy for tulips that I've extended my season for a period of over 12 weeks every year. So I have tulips from March right through till June. And I've done that with the aid of species tulips, which are the original wild tulips, which have grown since time began, I guess, but we know about them since the 11th century. And they're from the Middle East and beyond, so the Tian Shan, Pamir Alai, and Caucasus Mountains. But I've persuaded them to flower in our garden in Wiltshire. No mean feat, given how much rain we have, but they're doing really well, and I'm using them quite a lot in my horticultural design back at home. And we're going to talk about that later with Lindsey. But first, this is my home. We live in Wiltshire, which is between London and Bath in the UK. So if you draw a line from London to Bath, we're just over halfway through. And it's a Georgian house dating from 1760. Very typically Georgian. There's 4 large rooms on each floor, and luckily we have 4 children, so they have a very nice room each, but they fight over the bathrooms because we don't have so many. We have a very floral themed house, much to my family's consternation. Everything that comes through the door seems to have a flower attached to it. So you'll see here on the wall On the left-hand side, those are prints by Basilius Besler, dating from 1613. And I love the fact that those prints on the wall actually illustrate the flowers which are on the table. So those actual flowers on the table date back to the same period as the prints on the wall. And they're part of my historic collection. So it gives me a real thrill. Every time I bring flowers into the house, I can actually match them with a few of these very special antiques which I've been collecting. We lived here since 2006. We inherited a beautiful garden in a state of decay. I think we really needed Lindsey at that point, but I've only just met her. But we did have help from Arnie Maynard, who's a very well-known UK garden designer who's working over here now. However, at the beginning, it was just me on my own. And I had huge flower beds. I didn't know what to put in them, so I filled them with tulips. And they exploded the following spring, and I thought I was really clever. And of course, it was just the tulips with their great big fat bulbs. Because the tulips, as you know, in the US and the UK, they're imported from Holland, nearly all of them. And they're chemically, I'm a bit mean to say they're chemically bred, but they certainly receive a lot of chemicals to bulk them up artificially to create the biggest possible flower. So at the beginning, I used those the whole time. That's the house in the winter, I should add. It doesn't look like that quite now, but you can see we get cold winters and warmish, wet summers. We're zone 8, but I suppose we're at the sort of periphery of how you can grow tulips in the wild, but we work it quite effectively. That's the walled garden. Arnie Maynard helped us put that design in when we first arrived. It doesn't look particularly tulipy here. That's because all the beds are actually nursery beds for my historic collection. The historic tulips which we have, we buy new originally, and then I propagate from them, which means I peel off the little bulblets, and then I grow them all on until they're big enough to flower, so sort of 2 or 3 years later. So you see one little row of tulips here, which is Di Serono, Havran and Cairo, which I've planted perennially to come back year after year. And the other beds are all filled with tiny bulbs, which you can't see in flower yet. However, that's my flower field. I have an acre, I think, approximately, which is fenced off. You can see we've got sheep in the background. So the really tall fences keep out the Hebridean sheep, and they keep out deer, which are one of our main predators. But they don't keep out squirrels, which are a real pain. And I've seen plenty of squirrels around the gardens here this morning. Also something tiny with little stripes on it. Well, I thought the chipmunk was really, really sweet, but apparently not. Okay, thank you. So these are the flowers I grow for cutting. I have a small business, Bainton Flowers, and I used to grow about 10,000 a year for cutting. But when I realised, in fact, I was buying all these bulbs in new, and then I couldn't really do anything with them afterwards because I'd cut the stems or pulled them right down, and therefore I couldn't replant the bulbs. I realised that actually it wasn't in line with my organic status to bring in these chemically grown bulbs every year. So now I grow about a quarter of that amount, 2,500, and of course I've written the book, and now I'm getting massive demand from all of the florists for my lovely organic flowers. So I'm going to have to work that one out. I'm not quite there yet with that. We do grow a lot of annuals still, however, in containers like this. And when they've finished flowering, I leave them in the containers for a few weeks to die back, and then I lift all of the bulbs with the greenery and stems attached, and I dry them all out in racks back of house, and then I plant them all over again in rough areas, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So we recycle all of these tulips from containers. These are doubles. They're not quite so easy to naturalise because of their massive flower heads. They don't look as natural as a lot of the ones like this, which we do manage to recycle. So that's one of my black and white mixes with a bit of yellow thrown in. That's Paul Scherer, Jan Roos, Francoise, which are all Triumph tulips, which recycle really well. And then Wallflower, Flaming Parrot, which are the red and yellow ones, which I have to say I adore, but they don't look so natural when they're planted out in the garden. And then Dom Pedro. And Dom Pedro, you can just see there's one on the bottom right, a few a bit further up on the right. They're mahogany brown, and those are the first historic tulips. I ever bought, so they are responsible for my entire tulip habit. They have a colour unlike any of the annual tulips. They're like a sort of really well polished antiquarian book. It has a depth and a radiance to it, a real antiquity, which I've yet to find in the annual tulips, however hard the breeders try to get that same result. And this is another scheme, back of house again, and you can see the scale. We really like big containers because when people arrive for our open days, they're greeted by these huge displays. They're also much easier to look after because you're watering one big area, you're checking for slugs around one rim, and then when you lift them, they're all out in one go. So we go large, but we have a large property, so we're able to do it. And for those who are interested, that's apricot fox with brown sugar and café noir, which is a lovely rich mix. I love these apricots and peaches with blacks, although of course there never has been a truly black tulip. And that's what I do afterwards. I recycle them all over our driveway verges. So we have long driveways and we get this very naturalistic effect. We dry all the bulbs out from the containers, we put them back in here, and then you get these wonderful different heights, very unlike a municipal planting where everything's put in every year and then it's taken out and it's all thrown away. We like the fact that they're all different heights, they're all different stages of growth. So we find with these perennialized mixes, there's certain tulip divisions which work really well. Traditionally, people rely on the Triumph and Darwin hybrid divisions, but I've found in my own experience that anything lily-flowered comes back really effectively year after year. So old favourites like Ballerina, Burgundy, Marilyn, White Triumphata, those are really good bets, and there's a whole chapter or section about this in my book if it's something which interests you. And the other ones are Viridiflora tulips, which are the ones which have the green in the petals. So you've got things like spring green, flaming spring green, Vera Chic, Artist, those ones, they come back really well as well. So I would suggest you try those. I'm going to talk briefly about species tulips, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I know this is something Lindsey might pick up on later. These ones are called Tulipa acuminata, although they've just been renamed cornuta. They decided to rename them as my book went to press. So I had a horrible moment where I insisted to the editor we go through and we get it right as of now, and she looked at me and said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah." So these are the ones, you can see they're the red ones here, and they've got needle or dagger petals, and they're exactly the same ones which featured in all of the artwork from the Ottoman Empire. Here, this is a watercolor album from Sultan Ahmed's reign in 1725. But if any of you have been to Istanbul and you've been to the Blue Mosque and the other temples, you'll see that this is the same tulip, Tulipa acuminata, which is represented in all of that tile work. And I grow it naturalized around the garden, which gives me a real thrill every time I walk around. We also have this tulip, Tulipa sylvestris. It's native in the UK. Do you have it here in the States?
Yes.
As a wildflower or cultivated?
No, we have planted it in the rock garden, and it's one of the ones that does spreading life very well for us.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Well, it's known as the woodland tulip or wild tulip. It's actually invasive in Scandinavia because it does so well, so it's got a sort of warrant on it there. But we really like having it in our garden, and I like the fact that the tulip, which we always consider as a cultivated flower, here it looks truly natural. To the extent I wouldn't put it in a container. It doesn't want to be contained at all, this one. And this is Beatrix Potter's painting of it. So not many people know that Beatrix Potter actually honed all her skills by creating botanical studies before she started her Peter Rabbit books. And if you look at how she's depicted the reflexed petals and the yellowing leaves, you'll see that she really did have a talent which follows through into her children's books. And these are some of my historic tulips. These are what we call breeder tulips, which are single-coloured. Some of them actually at the back are bicoloured. And that's my Dom Pedro at the front right, the brown one, which is hanging forward. That's the first one I ever found. Breeder tulips like this, they're called breeder because they are the ones from which the very famous broken pattern tulips were bred from. So here are your broken tulips. They're also called rectified or variegated. And these ones are responsible for tulip mania in the 1600s. So tulip mania really encapsulated in 3 years, 1634 to 1637. It was caused by a massive demand for these. They look designed, they're not. They're totally spontaneous breaks from breeder tulips. And at that point, one of these bulbs would sell for up to 10,000 guilders, which in today's money is the equivalent to the most expensive townhouse in Amsterdam. So one bulb was worth millions of pounds. Whereas today, I probably buy them for $10 each. That's enough. But would it that I were alive in the 17th century with my collection? These two are part of my collection here. These are called Duke van Tolls, and they date from 1595. So these tiny little tulips have been repeating themselves year on year on year with good, clever stewardship from practiced breeders and amateurs like me, and they've been lasting for 450 years. So these flower in March, and they come up like pops of sweets in the soil. You can't believe you've got this bare soil, and then these bright pops of colour, and somehow, whatever the weather, they survive. This is an early one, also called Loch van Rijn, recorded as 1620. If any of you know Claudia, it's like a mini Claudia, but just with more sort of reverential antique colours to it. And this painting here, by Ambrosius Boschart the Elder, you can see that same tulip popped in behind the red and yellow one right up at the top. So if you see the massive, that coloration is called Bizarre Red and Yellow, and there's the Loch van Rijn tucked in just behind it. And one of the things I do is actually help people identify the tulips. And by identifying the tulips, which are all recorded in literature, so in the Florilegium from this date, it can help actually date the paintings. So it's quite an interesting way to go about it, is actually through the tulips. Jacob Marrell painted this one here, or this trio, and if I go back to the Boschart here, you can see the same red and white coloration here. That coloration is called rosen, or rose, and that was the most expensive one you could actually buy, the red and white. That's the Semper Augustus. 12 bulbs only ever survived of that, and actually sadly they don't survive to this day. They were prevalent in the 17th century, but they're no longer alive. Although I have an equivalent here called Silver Standard, which I grow. This one's dated from 1760, very early to flower. It's actually a single early, whereas nearly all my other historics are very late. They flower into May, and that very late flowering is one of the reasons that they became unfashionable. Because our tulip industry now, our cut flower business, seems to think that tulips are in season from Christmas. So it's created this demand from Christmas, and by May, everyone's really bored of tulips. They think it's peonies and roses, whereas in fact, the old ones are all in flower in May. So we need somehow to change that perception. This is going back to our dining room at home. You notice the floral wallpaper, you can't get away from flowers. And a painting which is by Van Tielen, who was a pupil of Daniel Seegers. Daniel Seegers trained Van Tielen amongst others, so I hasten to add this is not something which is of extreme rarity or value, in case you were thinking of coming to do a heist. Underneath it, the historics are all lined up. Again, these are the ones which I grow. And I can place these tulips actually in the painting. So I have great fun interpreting the painting through my fresh flowers. Similar, I think, to how Lindsey, you're going to talk about this as well, but Lindsey's book Art in Flower, where she's interpreting famous paintings through her floral arrangements. I hasten to add she does it in a much more sophisticated way than I do. I just plunk mine in glass vases, but something a little different here. Tulips in beer bottles. These are English florists' tulips, which date back 200 years, most of them, and they're in beer bottles for a very specific reason. The tulip societies in England, which were prevalent from the early 1800s, 200 societies there were at that point, all of the meetings and the shows were held in public houses or inns, and the tulip bottles here is what they had to hand. So the beautiful brown, which happens to offset these jewel-like colours, is simply because it's what they had. These ones are on their way up to Wakefield in Yorkshire, which is where I show them. And we cut them short and put them in the bottles, partly to stop them growing. So tulips, those of you who buy them or grow them will know that when they're in water, they just don't stop growing. So if you cut them short like this, they're held quite nicely for the show bench. And here are those two same tulips, a breeder on the left and a broken one on the right. Does anyone know what causes the tulips to break? Has anyone got an idea? Tulip breaking virus, known as TBV, spread by aphids of all things. And that wasn't discovered until 1927. Before that, everyone thought it was some type of alchemy. And these are the colourways. You can see the depth of colour in these English florists' tulips. And they're always viewed from above and judged from above. So from the show bench, they're put on low tables, and the judges go along the top and they view them from that angle. And on the left is a flame, where that colour, the deep burgundy, licks all the way up the centres of the petals and out to the edges. It flames out. And on the right is a feather, where it's just feathered all the way around the tops of the petals, as if you've got a paintbrush and dipped it in ink. And they have to be that delicate, and they have to be completely symmetrical to win on the show bench. So last year I won an enormous trophy, and this year I couldn't get back to the main show, which was very disappointing, but at least it meant that there was no pressure on me to win the silverware yet again. This is my final slide before we chat with Lindsey. Why do I do it? Why do I collect all of these very, very old tulips and plant them every year and feed them and deadhead them, dig them up in July, dry out the bulbs, catalogue them for plant heritage? Really, I do it for the love of flowers, the sheer joy they bring me in my life. I do it because they're endangered species and I want them to last for future generations. And I do it because I want to prove that you can do it all organically. You don't need chemicals, because the whole industry relies so heavily on the chemical side of it. And I want to show it's not necessary. If you do it well and if you give them love, they'll come back year after year and give back to you as well. So thank you for listening.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
So Hugh Morgan in one of his newsletters wrote that the tulip bulbs you buy from Holland have been treated with insecticides. And he's sort of tried to indicate some sources that are organic.
And I was very grateful to Hugh Morgan for raising that, because if you buy the book, you'll see that it's a theme that runs the whole way through the book. They've been buying a few organic varieties we have one supplier in the UK who sells organic bulbs. And the range, unfortunately, is very small at the moment, so it's tricky. They are treated in Holland, but I hasten to add that they've got much stronger limits on the chemicals than we have in the UK. So there's something to be said from growing them from the Dutch ones. But that's why I've cut my numbers down so dramatically. And all of the historic ones I grow, I propagate myself. So I'm not importing. But it's an issue, I think, which is now getting a little bit more possible to talk about without upsetting people. But yes, thank you for that.
Thank you, Polly. That was incredible.
It was a potted plot. You got the short version.
Oh my gosh, I want the long version. I want the all day long version.
Well, there's so much to talk about.
I know.
There's
I
so
don't even
many.
know where to start.
Yeah, right. We'll start.
When are your open days, or when do you open your garden?
We opened them in April. It's been tricky actually the last couple of years because our tulip season's been 2 or 3 weeks earlier than it has historically.
Right.
So we find we're really having to sort of nurture our tulips to keep them growing. But it's about, we aim for the 20th of April and the 1st of May each year. And we open through the National Garden Scheme in the UK. So do you know the National Garden Scheme?
Yes,
Yeah.
but I don't know if everyone here does, but
I would really recommend, if you go online and look at National Garden Scheme UK, it's a window into English country gardens. So you don't have to go and visit them. There's fantastic resources on the website. But if you are coming to the UK, then you can find out what gardens are going to be open in your area and book online. And it's fantastic. It's a sort of portal into a whole new world of private gardens.
Yeah, people are familiar here with the Garden Conservancy. It's the same
Exactly.
program, and it's what Frank Cabot modelled. The English program is what Frank Cabot modelled the Garden Conservancy on to create the scheme we have here in the US. So if you're familiar with that Gardens program, then this is the original and better version.
Fantastic. And I'm actually doing a talk online with the Garden Conservancy
Oh, lovely.
in the autumn. So if you look out for that,
Oh,
you'll
great.
learn more there as well.
Oh, that's great. The online talks are wonderful. And speaking of an early spring, and I was talking to a local grower here who does tulips, who was really fascinated about the environmental impact of bulbs and didn't know about that. And she's someone who's doing a lot of environmentally conscious practices in her growing with water and soil and approaches. So that, I mean, and I'm really kind of stunned by that too. And I think it is important to talk about bulbs in general. I mean, can't just be tulips.
No, I mean, tulips are my example, but I think the problem is the Dutch tulip industry has relied on chemicals for so long because they're terrified of tulip fire, which will wipe out whole fields of them.
Okay.
So I do understand that for them it's a massive risk not to treat with chemicals. But I think we've got so addicted to getting these tulips so earlier in the year, wrapped in cellophane, just as a commodity, and the prices get lower and lower. Whereas if we appreciated the ones which local growers are growing, so the tulips I grow as a cut flower are 70 or 80 centimetres high. Mm-hmm. They have beautiful large flower heads, they're scented. They're an entirely different beast to the supermarket tulips. Mm-hmm. And I think if we could just look out for the local growers and support them and get away from this whole commodity, then there'll be much less demand and less chemical use down the line. Mm-hmm. So it is a big difference. I mean, it's a massive issue for me. And I'm working very hard to try and do it different ways, hence the perennializing, hence the species tulips.
And with the perennializing, can you just walk us through, just as home gardeners, how, like, can we also save the bulblets and dry and replant our own tulips? Or would you just, can you just walk us through that process a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. I think if you've got a big enough garden, it's really worth trying to recycle the tulips in the way that I do. So leave them in your containers for a few weeks to die back, and then they photosynthesize, and that energy goes back into the formation of a new bulb. What you want is one big new bulb to plant out. You can try with the little bulblets, but really those are better put into a nursery space like my walled garden, because they're going to take a few years to grow back. So you want to take your one big bulb and plant that back, and that gives you the best chance of a flower the following year. Sometimes they take a year or two to come back, so you might have to wait, and sometimes you want to supplement with some new ones as well to give a good display.
So is that better, taking them out once they've photosynthesized, is that better than just leaving them in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because what they really want is a period of dormancy.
Really
Where they grow in the wild, they have very cold winters and wet springs, and then they bake all summer. And where we live, certainly that's not possible. Here, you might stand a better chance of it, but you're also going to find they're going to get eaten by your chipmunks and your squirrels and so forth. So
Right.
you're battling a bit
Right.
against nature.
Right.
You can help them by taking them up and drying them, and then you take off the old tunic, the brown skin on the bulb. Mm-hmm. Check under it. If it's got spots under it and it might be a bit diseased, then burn it. Don't put it on your compost system. And if it looks nice and clean, then plant them back again in the autumn or fall.
Does anyone here do that in the audience? Okay, NYBG does it.
There you go.
And can you just tell us a little bit about what you do here to?
I'm a little bit different because what I typically do is it's going to be if we are lifting some of the tulips that have perennialized anyway, rather than but I do teach this process because I teach bulbs as part of the practical horticulture program. So this is a question that often comes up. I also do introduction to bulbs for gardening. So this is something that I tell people on a 3 times a year as we have this conversation. The main obstacle, of course, being the deer and the groundhogs and the chipmunks and the squirrels. So generally, what I recommend is we actually get, if there's a particular tulip that you want to come back, it really actually involves caging it in a wire cage to prevent the herbivory on them. But it is relatively straightforward. I mean, the key being to find somewhere that is actually has really good drainage and preferably can get a nice dry summer baking. So somewhere like our rock garden is ideal for that. But I think most people have Even in my 1930s farmhouse, I thought, tulips that find themselves in a crack or a crevice where a rodent can't get them, and they will reliably perennialize. And for us here, exactly as you said, it's the triumphs, the Darwins, the lily-flowered ones that come back, the Ridifloras as well. And what I generally recommend for us, is stronger primary colors. So strong reds, strong yellows, whites as well. The more fanciness you've got on it, the less likely they are to perennialize. So for perennializing tulips, I would avoid parrots, fringed ones, any of the ones with a lot of kind of color in them. Try and stick with solid primary colors, and then you're most likely to have the most success. But
Sure.
again, if you can keep the critters off, they will perennialize very well. And most of what the damage also seems to do is when you're incorporating them into your flower gardens, rather than just growing them separately out in the containers, is they tend to suffer from collateral damage during the process of gardening.
Right,
You digging
right,
into
of
them,
course.
that seems to
Okay.
be where the most damage actually happens. Because people forget they've got them planted, or they
Of course.
want to put annuals over them, or tropicals or whatever, and then they just get planted through.
Actually, also for that reason, I don't do any herbaceous displays of annual tulips at all, because it's so complicated gardening around
really
them,
have to,
taking them in,
yeah.
taking them out.
That's a big issue too, is making sure that you know where you put them so you don't damage them.
That's true.
Because they will, especially,
Plenty of
you
them
start out with these huge bulbs you get from Holland, and again, a lot of it is talking people down to say, they're not going to look like they did the first year, but they will still be beautiful. You just have to accept that they're going to be smaller and a little bit less dramatic.
Which is the effect I think a lot of gardeners are now after, is this more natural effect. So the ones you saw on the verges there, that's exactly what we're getting. It's a sort of ripple of tulip. Although, funnily enough, I don't perennialise the primary colours because I don't like that look in my garden. So instead we concentrate on the lily-flowered and the verdifloras in the softer colours. But the red and yellow ones have got the apple dawn blood in them, which is why they perennialise so brilliantly. And actually I went back to Hortus Balborum, which is the Museum of Tulips, Living Museum of Tulips, north of Limmen, and the chairman is called Mr. Appledawn. So it was a wonderful chance meeting.
It's very interesting, so we get into talk about sort of colour theory, but the primary colours definitely look better here than they do in England in the spring. The brighter colours, something about the light levels, I don't know what it is.
I might have to duke that out with you later.
No, just having done this for like almost 30 years, you find that just when you're trying to do those colour combinations is like my rock garden is all pastel colours, but as far as the way the light makes them pop, they really do actually look a lot better than they might do in England.
I can see that's another conversation.
Take it up with them later. Species tulips. I mean, I'm really curious about using those more in my garden schemes, and particularly with so much of the gravel gardening that's going on. They just really, I think, naturalize well and mix well with that type of garden style.
Yeah, I agree.
Can you speak a little bit to that, like how to get started? And they do naturalize.
They naturalise and they plant themselves deeper, so they don't get in the way of other gardening. So if you're putting them in, I mean, if you're gardening a gravel garden, once you've popped them in, you've got your drainage already built in because of the gravel, and they drop themselves deeper. Quite a lot of them actually have droppers, so they drop down from the main bulb to create new bulbs, or they have stolons, so they go along, so they establish themselves very nicely within a garden context, and the pests seem to ignore them much more. So you'll find once you've got them planted and they've established themselves, the squirrels ignore them, the deer pretty much, they don't get much of a meal from them for a start. So I think they're a really good new direction to go in, and you're not having to replace them every year. Sure, you can still play with them and plant them in containers, and in fact I've got a whole chapter on, I have about 3 dozen different varieties in containers, and I've spent a lot of time at Cambridge Botanic Garden and Kew Garden, which have 2 collections of species tulips, so I've learned a lot from them. So start in containers, see what you like, and put them in the garden. But they naturalise brilliantly. As you said, even in cracks, we have Tulipa saxatilis or saxatalis, that will actually plant itself in little cracks around the garden. And then we have little beauty all over our gravel driveway areas. And the joy of those, when they've finished flowering, you've got barely any foliage to dry back. So it's not like in a garden situation with massive annuals and you've got these very unsightly leaves. they've got really small strap-like leaves which disappear very quickly.
Right.
So they're easy to incorporate in that way.
That's a very good point. The foliage
Yeah.
of the bulbs you choose, and I find that too with narcissus. There's a lot of finer leaf, more species narcissus that you can work with, and you're not dealing with that.
They don't spoil it for the next
They
few
don't-
weeks,
exactly.
unlike your municipal plantings where you've got so many of the non-species, the cultivars marching through. Yeah.
And I'm noticing that there's more and more species bulbs available to us here with our catalogs.
Yeah, I've been looking at, I have some suggested suppliers in the back in the book. So I was looking at Brent and Becky's last night. I don't know if you use them.
Oh yeah, very much.
But they have a fantastic array of the species bulbs, including new ones like Danique, which have only been available for a few years. So they're right on it with the species bulbs. So
That's great.
I would suggest looking at them. And they also have the most beautiful colourways in that catalogue.
But still, all those now with the species tulips, are those coming from Holland? Are Brent and Becky breeding them? Do you think on their in Virginia?
Well,
wherever it is
we're
they-
now having them, places like Kevok Plants in the UK are breeding them themselves. So we are finding those are being bred at home, and therefore they're not subject to so many of the same regulations. Although in the UK we are still allowed to use neonics, whereas you're not in Europe. So they are easier to breed, and also for you to keep breeding yourself. So plant them in your containers, empty them in the autumn, because they can actually sit, species tulips, pop them under cover in your containers so they don't get rained on. And you'll find come the autumn, you've got nice dry bulbs. You can take them up, repot them, or put them out in the garden. So they're very easy to handle. They're also smaller, so everything about them's nice and easy.
More manageable.
Exactly, and delicate.
Delicate. Yeah, that's so true. Because there are some bulbs, like Dom Pedro is not available here.
No, and at the moment it's
In
not
Canada
available in
it
the
is.
UK either.
It's not available in the UK. And what? And just do you understand why that is? I did get some for a garden I work on here through Canada, because I'm Canadian. So I figure I'm allowed to do that.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Don't tell anyone. But
Yeah,
But,
they come in and out of fashion. I'm
is
slightly
that what
worried.
it's a fashion thing?
I'm slightly worried I bought up all of the Dom Pedro and then people having seen me grow them, they bought the rest the next year and they haven't been able to keep up with the demand. But tulips are so dependable upon the weather, and they've had really bad flooding in Holland in all of the fields this year, so prices have gone up. So we're going to have the follow-on effect of that as well. But my advice is actually don't go for the fashionable tulips because everybody else has got them. Go for the ones which you think are not going to appeal. So things like La Belle Époque, that has got ridiculously popular.
Attention for cut.
Yeah, for a cut flower.
It's
And
a big, juicy, if you don't know it, kind of fleshy colored,
It's
almost
a-
like
yeah,
a peony.
it's a
almost
double.
like
It's very, very beautiful. And
it's an unusual
it has sort of
color.
vintage feel to
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
But people have gone mad about it, especially brides. And so what's actually happening is that the bulb companies can't fulfill the orders and they're substituting for something which is very inferior. So I say go for the really unfashionable ones and create your own look rather than going to Sarah Raven or Martha Stewart or whoever who all do it brilliantly, but do it your own way. It's a really nice way of having fun in the garden.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so I have so many questions. Soil. So you talk about soil and in your book a lot, and using seaweed. Can you speak about that? Like, how do you use seaweed? Is that like a top dressing? Is that a liquid foliar thing? Or?
So we use seaweed, which we dilute when we water the plants. So as soon as the tulips start showing a bud at the very bottom, so you get your first couple of leaves, and then you get a bud showing right at the base. That's generally 6 weeks from that moment until flowering time. And during that 6 weeks, we water, depends on what the weather's doing. If it's raining hard, we will just water in a feed every 2 weeks, watering it from the base always, so you don't get the colour of the seaweed splashing on your foliage and flowers. And we do that every 2 weeks, right through until it's finished flowering. Then we water once again with the feed, and then we leave them after that point. But you can use, ours is called Shropshire seaweed, Shropshire's a county in the UK which has no coastline, so we haven't quite worked this one out yet. If it was called Cornish seaweed, we'd understand, but Shropshire seaweed. But you can also use dilute tomato feeds as well. So we use those, and there are really good ranges of those here and in the UK, which they're all organic.
And even though it's a bulb and it should have all that it needs within that, you still feel that it
For the
helps.
cut flowers, it gives them a little bit of a boost.
Okay.
And for the flowers which I'm having in containers and I want to recycle the bulbs, it gives them that extra bit of sort of attention and the nutrient levels so that the bulb will fatten up for the next year. So we do find it worthwhile. I wouldn't, if I've got a planting of species tulips all through my herbaceous beds, I wouldn't water those at all. They have to fend for themselves. And for the perennialised ones in grass, I wouldn't water that because particularly with the tomato feed, all that's going to do is feed the grass, which is then going to compete with the tulips. And tulips do not want a thick sward to grow up through. They won't thrive like that. But in your containers and for cutting, then I would water, feed.
And in the meadowy grass area, no, you're not cutting that at all, or
No, I deadhead, because if you don't deadhead, you're going to have a very strong likelihood, A, that you're going to form the seed heads, and you won't get a good sized bulb, and B, if you're leaving all the tulip petals to fall, you're going to end up with this sort of rather mouldy environment at the base of the flower, and that's when botrytis, Tulipa botrytis, is then going to flourish, and you're going to lose your perennial plantings. The other thing I would say is, every so often, give your ground a complete break from tulips. Leave it fallow from tulips, plant narcissus. Don't try and be greedy and have tulips every single year. You know, that year have them in containers or have them somewhere else, but give your ground a break, because I think we ask too much repeatedly of the soil. We expect it to keep healthy the whole time, and yet it's too monocultural.
right.
On the point, one thing I didn't mention earlier is all my historic collection, they're all planted on sand. So I have 20 raised beds and I have a 5 centimetre layer of sand which all the historic bulbs go on so that they don't rot in the soil. And then when I lift them each year, all that sand gets incorporated back into the soil, and that helps the drainage.
Because they really want a nice, fast
They
draining.
want to be
So
free
raised
draining.
beds
Raised
help.
beds help, and they help the back as well.
Right.
And they create this lovely free draining environment. We plant them quite a distance from each other to allow for air circulation. And we also have a rotation. So if we have tulips in one of the raised beds one year, then for the next 3 years, that bed has anything but tulips in it. So we'll have a green manure like mustard caliente or phacelia, and then we'll have a flower crop like cosmos, or we'll grow squash for the house. So we like to give it a break and put different nutrients back in.
That's great. Wow. It's a lot of work.
It's a ridiculous amount of work.
Because we have that problem with wet winters and wet springs now. And bulbs aren't really handling that very well, particularly tulips. So the raised beds is a helpful.
Exactly. I mean, in a cutting garden context or for my collection, it's perfect. But of course, in your sort of planting out in your garden, it's not going to be realistic in the same way, which is where the containers come into play, because you can create really good drainage. I don't know if any of you, I'm doing a masterclass on bulbs, mostly for containers this afternoon. So some of you might be hearing a lot more on that subject later.
I just want to touch on your pressing, herbarium pressing that you do with saving. So you save your tulips in another way, and Polly talks a little bit about this in her book, but I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I've been trying to keep a record of all the historic tulips that I grow. If any of you have tried pressing tulips, you'll know that it's quite difficult because the tulip has a huge amount of moisture in it. Yeah. So you want to cut them on a very, very dry day, not first thing in the morning or last thing in the evening, which is when you're usually told to cut flowers. So you want to actually cut them just in the middle of the day when they're much drier, and then you take them inside, cool place. You place them between your layers of blotting paper, and then either in a press or under your very heavy books. And then you have to keep replacing the blotting paper every 2 or 3 days to draw the moisture out. So it's a little bit, it's a bit fiddly because you have to keep going back to them to do it. But if you do that, you find you get no mold spores and you end up with the most beautiful dried tulips at the end.
So it holds you'll hold the color.
It will hold
Somewhat.
the colour, yeah,
Okay,
no,
amazing.
pretty well actually,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, the easiest ones to do are the species tulips
Right,
because
so
they're so
delicate.
much more delicate. But I'm doing the historic ones as a record with conjunction with Plant Heritage, who's the plant conservation charity I hold my national collection with. So it's for their resources, and then it all goes online on their Persephone system.
Great.
And I'm also doing it with RHS Wisley for their herbarium. So they're coming down and then they take samples and they take those back and they press them all for their records.
Incredible.
So it's a really nice way of preserving it again for the future.
And you mentioned you have a little film that you can find online of you doing this.
Yes, if you go onto my website, which is called Bainton Flowers, you'll find there's a short film which was shot by the World of Interiors, and that shows me in this process and creating a collection in this beautiful herbarium box, which was created by my brother's family business, which is Antiquarian Books, based in Bath. So they're called George Bainton, and they do the most exquisite tooling on leather, and they've made me, it's enormous, this herbarium, and all my pressed species, they all go in there, and they're kept in the dark, and it's a perfect environment for them. Yeah, so World of Interior, you can go on the World of Interiors website as well, it's there as well. Yeah.
And just another question, have you traveled to the wilds to see species tulips? In the
No,
wild?
not yet,
Okay.
because I'm stuck at home in the UK during the flowering
Right,
season
of
every year.
course.
But
Okay.
we're looking to go to Kyrgyzstan in a year or two.
Okay.
So I've been gathering a lot of information about that, and there's a very good tour group called Greens Tours, and I'm trying
Greens
to Greens Tours,
Okay.
yeah, and I'm trying to get a small group of people together. So if there's any interested parties, we're trying to do that, and that will be in April in a couple of years' time because it takes quite a lot of planning. So we're looking at Kyrgyzstan and possibly Tajikistan.
Amazing.
But you can actually see them also in Greece as well in the spring.
Okay.
We have quite a few which grow very well in Europe.
Amazing. Does anyone have any questions? We're generating a lot of chat. Yes.
Why would you travel there? Are they still raising these tulips?
Because they're growing in the wild there. So
grow in
you're
the
seeing
wild.
them where they should be, where they come from originally. All tulips started their life in the wild, and then they were gathered and they were taken to what we now call Turkey, and they were hybridized over a long period there before they made their way to Europe. So they made their way to Europe in the 1500s, but before that, they were all in the wild, and there's now about between 80 and 120 different wild species still in existence, but battling with all sorts of issues, climate change and overgrazing. So they're being protected quite well in some areas. Yeah, there's programs going on. There's more work to do, but they are being protected.
That'd be amazing to see.
Question there?
Yes, your love of history comes through very strongly, and I find that very moving. And I wanted to know if there are any particular historical anecdotes that you have about any of the tulips that you might that I don't know, is that a particular favorite of yours?
Well, I love the fact that the person, the director of the first botanical garden at Leiden in the Netherlands was a man called Carolus Clusius. And I've been to the botanical gardens there, and was very excited to see his statue and to see what they're growing. But what I loved most of all was his permanent battle against animals and people stealing his tulips. So it's a very personal, I find this very personal connection that he had to fence in all of his tulips back then. And I'm doing exactly the same today. And it just goes to show that the effort and the love which has gone in to keeping these over successive centuries. So yes, Clusius, he had all the same issues that I had.
Well, so he'd be the figure that you'd sit down to dinner with.
Yeah, quite possibly, yeah. Although I'd have quite liked to sit down with a Bruegel or a Boschart and get them to paint me what they had as well. At that point, it was cheaper to commission a painting of a historic tulip, or of course they weren't historic then, they were current, but it was cheaper to commission a painting of a tulip than to buy the tulip bulb. Extraordinary.
2 questions. I was wondering how many staff you have to help you, and do you have a game plan from? Are you making money on any of this?
Well, my husband would say we have way too many, and I'd say we have way too few. I have a head gardener who's there 5 days a week, and I have 2 part-time people 2 days a week. But we have a 6-acre garden within a much bigger area, and we have the business. Do I make any money? I sell the cut flowers to florists in London, and so that works quite well. And then I'm doing lecture days and workshops and so forth. But actually, most of what we do is opening the garden for charitable causes, and so that's a decision we've made.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, I did order bulbs from Organic Bulbs UK, and they can never figure out how to get them past customs.
Yeah. Did you ever get them past customs?
I finally, on December 10th, when they still hadn't arrived,
Yeah.
I canceled the order. It was just
Yeah.
getting absurd.
I don't think you'll get them. I get so many requests for bulbs to be shipped here, and I'm not allowed to ship them here. So I'm afraid I wouldn't risk it in future.
Okay.
I think until you have your own organic bulb suppliers here, then you're going to have to put up with buying them and then propagating them on yourself.
I found one, Wicked Tulips in Rhode Island, but it's a very limited mix.
Oh, okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
There's a
Yes,
hand.
it's a follow-on question to that. It's like, if you address it in your book, then that's fine. I'm going to get myself a copy shortly. But what I'm curious about is we can't grow the historic, the Rembrandts here, the broken ones, because of the TBB.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious for you, are there issues with growing, are they still infected, and are there issues with growing them with other varieties of tulips?
Okay,
And
so that's something which I addressed in the book, but I will explain briefly. They're illegal in the Netherlands except for within historic collections. So you've got them at Hortus Balborum, you've got Eric Braid, you've got a few in the Cook and Hoff walled garden. Other than that, they're illegal because they're petrified, they're going to spoil their flower fields. There are a few in which the virus is inert, and it's been proven to be inert. So Ancylene Day, Absalon, probably the lizard, a new one called Inner Wheel. Those have been grown, and there have been no breaks in plain breeder flowers as a result of it. But beyond those few, which are commercially available, there's a massive question mark. And the reason is to run the DNA profile on any of these individual cultivars is in the region of £60,000 and the dollar equivalent. And I tried to run some of those profiles and ran into that issue before I got even at a walking pace. So the way I do it, my broken ones are grown at a distance from the breeders. We separate them with barriers, but really you want a geographical distance between the two. Even if you do that, you are still going to get a few breaks. So if I get those breaks, I tie a coloured thread around each stem, and I very carefully dig that specimen out, and that joins the broken ones. But in storage, they have to be separate. They have to be handled separately. You have to go from the breeder beds, then wash your hands, and then go to the broken beds, so you don't transfer TBV. So it is really tricky.
So if anyone wants to know why you can't get some of these varieties in here, that is the reason, because it's a huge commercial liability, unfortunately, and USDA will not cooperate.
But a few are available here, and those
Rem's
ones.
favorite?
Rem's favourite is not a Rembrandt
Oh,
at
what
all.
is
No,
that?
that's really interesting. It's a
Oh.
triumph. So
Oh, okay.
you'll find that things like,
some breeding that have tried to make them look like them.
but they're
I see.
pretenders.
Alright,
So
it's a great tulip.
Rem's favourite is my favourite pretend Rembrandt.
Okay,
It's
great.
beautiful.
Okay,
Yeah.
because I use
No,
that a lot.
it's stunning, and actually combined with Queen of Night or
Yes,
Trey
that's how I do
Chic
it,
or
yeah.
any of those, it's stunning, and some of
Okay.
the oranges as well. It looks brilliant
Yeah.
with things like Jimmy.
Okay,
But,
Jimmy,
Helmar, that's another one which is pretending to be a Rembrandt. World Expression, Sorbet. There's a few of them which do it well.
Carnival, it's kind of like a
Carnival Denise. Yeah.
I mean,
Exactly.
they're very satisfying.
They're
if you're
they're
not,
stunning, But
Doing it for
I'm sorry to
historical.
disappoint you, they're nothing like the real thing. So you can
believe
see that, and the difference is phenomenal. But they are more robust, and you can get them, so enjoy them.
And so there are none, or there's some, like Old House would have
Old House
some,
have a few.
only buy
So-
10, and don't like then have your friends buy 10 for you and then another friend buy 10.
Exactly.
Try not to
Yeah.
be greedy.
Yeah.
I heard of someone doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if she's here today.
Yeah, so Old House is the best person to go to in the US if you want to try a few of these.
Right.
You know, buy 10, buy a dozen, grow them in a container, see if you get offsets. And in a domestic garden, it doesn't matter if they are going to break for
No,
you.
no,
You know, I can
yeah.
see why in a botanical garden it might, but in a domestic garden it really doesn't matter. Your
Right.
scheme is your own scheme,
Right,
so it's not
exactly.
an issue.
Great.
It won't damage the tulip, and it's the only example of a virus making a flower more beautiful.
Wow.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So embrace it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking and.
Thank